Section 1. The silence that felt normal. Silence doesn't always feel dangerous at first. Sometimes it feels comfortable, familiar, even respectful. That's why I didn't notice it right away. At the beginning, everything looked normal from the outside. Calls still happened, just shorter. Visits still happened, just less often. Conversations still existed, just lighter, safer, carefully chosen. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, and that's what made it easy to ignore. I told myself this was adulthood, that people get busy, that lives move forward and parents naturally step back. So I stepped back, quietly, without complaint. I didn't ask why plans were discussed after they were already decided. I didn't question why my opinions were met with polite smiles instead of answers. I didn't push when conversations ended faster than they used to. I believed silence meant respect. I believed space meant maturity. I believed patience would protect relationships. What I didn't realize was that silence can also be permission. Permission for others to decide without you. Permission to rewrite your place. Permission to slowly remove you without ever saying your name. At first, the changes were so small they felt harmless. Messages answered hours later instead of minutes. Invitations shared last minute. Updates delivered casually, as if they weren't important enough to mention earlier. When I noticed, I blamed myself. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I should be grateful they tell me anything at all. Maybe this is just how things are now. I didn't want to seem emotional. I didn't want to sound. Section 2. When questions stopped being welcome. At first, I didn't notice when my questions became a problem. They were simple questions, normal ones, the kind families ask each other every day. What are you planning? When did you decide? Should I be involved? No accusations, no pressure, just curiosity. But slowly, the responses changed, not in words, in tone. Answers became shorter, smiles appeared faster, conversations ended sooner. I would ask something and the room would shift, just slightly, enough to make me feel like I had crossed an invisible line. That's already sorted, they'd say. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Always calm, always polite, but never inviting. I started noticing how often my questions were followed by silence. Not awkward silence, strategic silence. The kind that discourages you from asking again. One evening, I asked about a family plan I had heard mentioned casually. "Oh, that?" she said quickly. "It's nothing important." Then she changed the subject. My son didn't look at me. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. I felt. Section 3. Decisions made without my voice. I didn't realize my voice was missing at first, because no one ever told me it was no longer needed. There was no announcement, no argument, no moment where someone said, "We'll decide without you now." It happened quietly. So quietly that for a long time I thought I was still part of everything. I found out through details that slipped out accidentally. A plan mentioned too casually. A decision already finalized before I even heard about it. A change explained as if I had already agreed. I hadn't, but no one noticed. And that hurt more than being told no. One afternoon, my son mentioned something in passing. "We're doing it next month," he said. I looked up. "Doing what?" I asked. He paused, just for a second, then answered, "Oh, didn't we tell you?" That pause stayed with me, because pauses carry truth people aren't ready to say out loud. "No," I replied calmly, "you didn't." He looked uncomfortable, not guilty, just surprised, as if my not knowing hadn't crossed his mind at all. That's when I realized something painful. They weren't hiding things from me. They simply weren't thinking of me. There's a difference. Hiding requires effort. Forgetting does not. From that day on, I started paying attention, not to what they said, but to what they assumed. They assumed I would understand. They assumed I wouldn't mind. They assumed my silence meant agreement. And every assumption moved me further out of the circle. I noticed how conversations had changed shape. Before, plans were discussed openly. Ideas moved back and forth. Opinions mattered. Now, decisions arrived fully formed, wrapped in polite explanations. We thought this would be best. It just made more sense. We didn't want complications. Complications. That word started appearing often, as if my involvement automatically created difficulty, as if my voice was a problem to manage instead of a part of the family. I wanted to speak. Many times I almost did. But every time I opened my mouth, I could already hear the response. You're overthinking it. It's not that serious. Why are you making it emotional? So I stayed quiet. Again. And silence, once repeated enough, becomes Section 4. The day I realized I was an outsider. Awakening to emotional shock to silent acceptance. There are moments that don't look important while they're happening. No loud words, no raised voices, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet realization that settles slowly and never leaves. That day came to me without warning. It wasn't a big event. It wasn't even a serious conversation. It was something small, too small to argue about, but big enough to change everything. I found out about a family gathering through someone else. Not an invitation, not a call, just a casual mention. "Oh, they're meeting this weekend," someone said. "You're not going?" I felt my chest tighten. "No," I replied, trying to sound normal. "I didn't know." The words tasted strange, because it wasn't that I couldn't go, it was that no one thought to ask. That was the first time the word outsider crossed my mind. I brushed it off at first, told myself there must be a reason, that maybe it was last minute, that maybe it wasn't important. But later that evening, when I finally asked, the answer came too easily. "Oh, it was just something small," my son said. "We didn't think it mattered." Didn't think it mattered. I smiled and nodded. Because what else do you do when your feelings don't seem to fit into the room? That night, I lay awake replaying everything, not just that moment, but all the ones before it. The shortened calls, the decisions already made, the questions that weren't answered. It all lined up suddenly, like pieces of a picture I hadn't wanted to see. I wasn't being pushed away loudly, I was being left out quietly. The next time I visited, I noticed things I hadn't before. Inside jokes I wasn't part of, conversations that paused when I entered the room, plans discussed as if I already knew. But I didn't, and when I asked, the answers were vague. "It's nothing. We'll explain later. Don't worry." Section 5. Watching my place disappear. Silent loss to emotional withdrawal to painful awareness. There is a special kind of pain that comes from watching something fade while you're still standing there. Nothing is taken suddenly. Nothing is announced. It just slips away. That's what it felt like watching my place disappear. I was still present, still polite, still available, but somehow I was no longer necessary. I noticed it in the smallest moments. Things I used to be told first, I now heard about last, sometimes from others, sometimes accidentally, and sometimes not at all. At first, I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. It's just information.
it's not personal. But the heart knows the difference. I realized I was no longer part of the beginning of conversations, only the end. Plans would already be shaped before I heard them. Decisions would already be settled before I was informed. I wasn't asked what I thought. I was told what had happened. And there's a quiet message hidden in that difference. Your opinion doesn't change anything. One afternoon, I sat with them while they discussed something important. I listened carefully. I waited for my turn to speak, but it never came. They spoke over me, around me, as if I wasn't there. When the conversation ended, my son smiled at me and said, "We'll fill you in later." Later. That word felt heavy, because later had become a place where I didn't exist. I started noticing how my role had changed. I was no longer someone whose presence shaped the room. I was someone whose absence wouldn't stop anything. And that realization hurt more than being excluded openly ever could. Because open rejection gives you something to respond to. Silent removal gives you nothing with questions. I began pulling back without meaning to, not out of anger, out of self-protection.
Section 6. The truth hidden in polite words. Politeness to manipulation to quiet realization. The hardest truths are not hidden in harsh words. They hide in polite ones. Smiles that come too quickly, explanations that sound reasonable, sentences designed to calm you instead of include you. That's where the truth was hiding all along, in the way things were said, not what was said. Every time I asked a question, the answer was gentle, careful, almost kind. We didn't want to stress you. We thought this would be easier. We didn't think it was important. Each sentence sounded harmless on its own, but together they formed a pattern where my involvement was always the problem, and my absence was always the solution. I started paying closer attention, not emotionally, observationally. I noticed how often decisions were justified instead of shared, how explanations came ready-made, as if rehearsed, how my reactions were managed before I even had them. They weren't trying to hurt me, they were trying to handle me. And there's something deeply painful about realizing you've become someone to manage instead of someone to respect. I remember one moment clearly. I asked about something small, a plan that had already been finalized. She smiled and said, "Oh, it just worked out this way." That was it. No details, no discussion, just a conclusion. And suddenly, I understood. These polite words weren't meant to inform me. They were meant to end the conversation, to prevent follow-up, to close the door softly instead of slamming it. My son would often add, "You know how it is," as if familiarity could replace honesty, as if knowing someone for years meant they didn't need to explain themselves anymore. But familiarity without respect becomes neglect, and neglect wrapped in politeness is still neglect. I realized that every explanation served the same purpose, to justify why I wasn't involved, not because I wouldn't understand, but because it was easier not to include me, easier to decide first, easier to explain later, easier to ask forgiveness than permission. Except no one even thought forgiveness was needed. Section 7. The power of stepping back. Silence to observation to inner shift. There comes a moment when speaking no longer brings clarity. It only brings more explanations, more reasons, more polite excuses that circle around the truth without touching it. That's when stepping back becomes more powerful than stepping in. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain myself. I simply became quieter. Not cold, not distant, just less available. I stopped asking questions that already had answers. I stopped offering help that was never really wanted. I stopped filling the silence they had created. And something interesting happened. The world kept moving. Decisions were still made. Plans were still finalized. But now they were made without even pretending to include me. And that confirmed everything I needed to know. Stepping back didn't create distance, it revealed it. I began to see patterns more clearly: who reached out only when needed, who avoided eye contact during important conversations, who spoke around me instead of to me. Silence sharpened my awareness. When you stop reacting, people stop acting carefully. They show their natural behavior. I noticed how my son relaxed when I wasn't involved, how discussions became shorter, how my presence was no longer required to validate decisions. That hurt, but it also freed me, because once you accept where you stand, you stop trying to change it. I started focusing inward, on my own thoughts, my own routines, my own emotional health. For years, my identity had been built around being needed, around being consulted, around being included. Stepping back forced me to ask a painful question. Section 8. When silence changed the balance. Shift, discomfort, power reversal. Silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means awareness. And awareness changes everything. When I stopped explaining myself, something subtle shifted. The balance. At first, no one noticed. They were comfortable with my quiet, comfortable with decisions moving forward without resistance. But silence has weight, and eventually, they felt it. Conversations became shorter, then awkward. Questions were asked differently, not openly, cautiously, as if they were unsure how much I knew. Because when someone stops reacting, it creates uncertainty. People wonder what you're thinking, what you're planning, whether you've finally seen the truth. I noticed how my absence in discussions was suddenly mentioned. She didn't say anything about it, as if silence needed approval now, as if my lack of response was no longer neutral. It was noticed, and it was unsettling. My son began checking in more often, not with warmth, with curiosity, asking simple questions that carried hidden concern. "Are you okay with everything?" I smiled gently. "I'm fine." And I meant it, because for the first time, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't waiting for inclusion. I wasn't expecting honesty. I was observing outcomes. Silence gave me perspective. I saw how quickly people fill the space when they feel watched, how explanations start coming without being asked, how politeness turns defensive. Section 9. The moment they realized I knew. There's a moment when the truth shifts sides, when the people who thought they were in control suddenly realize, you see everything. That moment didn't come with shouting or accusations. It came quietly, during an ordinary conversation. We were sitting together, talking about future plans I had already learned about without being told. They spoke carefully, choosing words, avoiding details, and for the first time, I didn't nod along. I asked one simple question, not emotional, not confrontational, just precise. "When did you decide this?" The room changed, not visibly, but emotionally. There was a pause that lasted half a second too long, a glance exchanged, a breath held, and that's when they knew. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't confused. I wasn't unaware. I already knew the answer. My daughter-in-law spoke first, her voice steady but too rehearsed. We thought it was better this way. Better. That word again. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I simply said, I understand. And I did. I understood everything. I understood that the decision had been made long ago, that my involvement was never part of the plan, that they assumed my patience would cover their choices. My son avoided my eyes, not because he was angry, because he was uncomfortable, because he realized something important. I wasn't hurt anymore. Section 10. The choice that changed everything. Acceptance, self-respect, quiet justice. The final change didn't come from them, it came from me. After everything I had seen, heard, and understood, there was only one choice left to make. Not revenge, not confrontation, but self-respect. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement that might never come, stopped hoping for an apology that was never promised, stopped measuring my worth by how included I was in their decisions, because the truth was clear. They didn't remove me suddenly. They slowly adjusted their lives until I no longer fit the picture. And once I accepted that, the pain softened, not because it didn't matter, but because I stopped fighting reality. I chose peace, not the kind they used as an excuse, but the kind that comes from knowing where you stand. I redefined my role, not as someone waiting on the sidelines, but as someone standing firmly in her own life. I focused on what I could control: my time, my energy, my dignity. I became present where I was valued, and distant where I was merely tolerated. I didn't close doors dramatically, I simply stopped holding them open. The result was